Bridging the Gap with Dr. Jacob Wilson.
What's up, everyone? I'm Dr. Jacob Wilson. I'm here with Charlie Ottinger, and welcome to our podcast. Today, it's going to be on training frequency, right? How frequently should you train every body part? I guarantee you, it's not what you think, right? You have to tune into this podcast to really find out about how to optimally train for training frequency for every body part. So, listen. If you love this content, make sure you hit that like button. If you really want to contribute to the channel and give back, share this video with your friends and people that you know. It's going to be beneficial for them, and it'll get the word out. Hit that subscribe button and also the bell. While we're at it, guys, we have a surprise for you. We built out a training program for your full body on how to grow. All you got to do to get that training program for free is head over to themusclephd.com. That's themusclephd.com. Pretty easy to remember. And it'll prompt you how to put in your information to acquire that free workout program, which is pretty much guaranteed to make you grow. So with that, let's get into the episode. Like I said, today's a really important topic, and that is going to be training frequency, which is essentially how many times you train a given body part a week. That's how we're going to define today, how many times you train a given body part per week. Now, intriguingly enough, if you look at, there was a paper that was out in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, 5-6 years ago, and they polled bodybuilders, and they actually found that the majority of them thought that you should just hit every body part 1 to 2 days a week, right? Well, which is pretty interesting. And I think if you look at like the Flex old school magazines, like when I was growing up, I read Flex magazine, muscular development, I didn't really read much, I didn't really read like Men's Fitness or anything, was it?
Muscle Fitness is about right through the line.
That's right through the line.
It just wasn't freaky enough.
It wasn't freaky enough, right? And so, but if you notice, their splits were like Monday, legs, Tuesday back, Wednesday off, right? Thursday, shoulders, Friday, arms, Saturday, Sunday off, repeat. And we grew up seeing this stuff, right? We're going to talk about, is that real? Is what people are thinking the best way to train? But before we really do that, we really need to talk about, well, what is it? What are the factors that impact training frequency? So would you say, Charlie, are some of the what would you say are your top 3 factors that impact training frequency?
Yeah, I think a lot of our knowledge, or even like the current paradigm of the field, is that you should just train every muscle twice a week, right? And that, we have science it's a fickle thing when it comes to stuff like this, because we're dealing with the constraints of variables, equivalencies between groups, all that stuff. So a lot of times you see, research projects examining training frequency, they have to equivalate volume between groups.
Yeah.
Well, what's the point of increasing your frequency more often than not? More overall volume.
Right.
And so, and I think our top scientist here, Matt Sharp, has a great quote about what I'm about to talk about. Is in exercise science, we're getting into this habit of doing meta-analyses before we're ready to do that. And a meta-analysis, for you guys that don't know, is essentially taking as many studies as you can find on a given topic, narrow it down to exactly what you're looking for, and then you're just examining the data and the findings from those studies and coming to some sort of general conclusion, or at least the conclusion that you think is right. So it's the author's opinion mostly. Right. So we have a meta-analysis on training frequency from, again, 5 years ago, I think it's 2016. And you'll see in the analysis that there's only 7 studies that they included in this. And if I remember right, 5 of the 7 are in untrained subjects. And most of them are equating volume between. It's just, how can we draw conclusions from that?
You can't. And you can kind of throw it up. You can if 5 of them are untrained subjects, you can kind of take that up and throw it away. You know what I mean?
They're all going to make gains.
They're all going to make gains.
So essentially, we can look at that as a basis for developing theory from, but it's not very critical thinking about the matter. And so What we're going to talk about today is get into a little bit more critical thinking on it. Let's get a little bit more clever about physiology and science and how that can dictate training frequency. So, the three major factors that impact training frequency. Well, we first need to talk about why do we have to rest and recover, right? The main reason we have to rest and recover is muscle damage. When we work out, we get sore. That soreness is caused by muscle damage and the inflammation response to that damage. So realistically, to train again, we want to make sure we've gotten rid of that muscle damage and we recover. Because if we have muscle damage or we have soreness, it affects muscle activation and it affects force production. Why would I train if I can't maximally activate a muscle or produce a lot of force? There's no point to work out, essentially. You're not going to make progressive overload in that instance. Right. So we need to ameliorate or get rid of muscle damage, essentially, to be able to train again. So the three main factors we're looking at are the things that influence how much damage a muscle experiences from training. What's the first one, Doc?
Yeah, well, muscle fiber makeup. So, muscle fiber makeup is one of the number one ways that impacts this. And so if you think about it, remember, we can broadly say we have two types of muscle fibers, right? Fast twitch and slow twitch. Fast twitch muscle fibers contract with a greater force. They have a greater ability to generate tension. Slow twitch muscle fibers have more ability to use oxygen, right? And they have more what we call mitochondria, which allows them to use more oxygen. So what ends up happening is fast twitch muscle fibers contract harder. As Charlie's talked about in a lot of his articles, more tension equals more damage. Okay, so if you have more fast twitch muscle fibers, you have more damage. If you have less mitochondria, you can have more oxidative stress, and that can cause damage too, non-tension derived damage. So we basically like to say is if you have more fast twitch muscle fibers, that you're going to have tend to have more muscle damage.
Yeah.
So guys, I know this is exciting content about frequency, and you're getting a lot of information, a lot of great information here. But what I want to do is cue you in to what is really like our crown jewel. Charlie, myself, Fernando, we've been working on an academy for the last 5 years straight. And of course, we've taken decades worth of information. And what we wanted to do was take all this information that we spent our whole careers on, multiple degrees, hours and hours of studying, countless all-nighters, and basically take that information and make it applied for you. And so what we've done is we created the Academy, Muscle PhD Academy. But what we're going to do, got a surprise for you today. We're going to give you a quick clip of that where you can learn some information. And at the end of that clip, we highly suggest you go up and sign up for the Academy, because I'm telling you right now, it's going to change your life. Check it out. Now, out of the motor cortex, you have these brain cells, clusters of brain cells that are called neurons, okay? So we have these neurons that come out of the motor cortex. You have an upper motor neuron that comes out of the motor cortex. It goes to the spinal cord. It connects to another cord or another connection in the spinal cord called a lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron comes out and then connects to the muscle, okay? And it connects to a number of muscle fibers. And that lower motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it controls, we call a motor unit, okay? So again, all muscle activation starts in the brain. It starts with an intent to want to do something. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more later, but that's a trait that's going to be specific to the muscle group, and it could even be specific to certain athletes in the way they train.
Right.
So that's, again, something else to consider. The second factor that impacts how frequently you can train a muscle is the size of the muscle, or more specifically, the essentially voluntary activation percentage of a muscle. So it's a real fancy way of saying essentially how easily can a muscle be activated. And we generalize that to the size of the muscle because more often than not, but not always, but more often than not, the bigger a muscle is, the harder it is to activate. So we examine this through involuntary muscle contractions, which are electrode induced or something similar, and then we flex as hard as we can, or against an isometric device or something like that, and we test or measure the disparity between the two. So small muscles like the biceps, the triceps to an extent, or even the tibialis anterior, those are all 95, 98, or even 100% voluntary active. The big muscles like the quads, we're looking about 84%, or the abs are about 85%. These bigger muscles are harder to activate. Well, what that means for a muscle damage is that the less muscle fibers you have active in an exercise, the less muscle fibers you're going to have damaged from an exercise. So also something to consider that impacts that training frequency. Then what's the last point, Doc?
Well, last one is range of motion, which we don't see. People in the gym don't really use full range of motion all the time. Rarely, especially when they're doing squats or legs in general. I feel like legs are probably the least range of motion I see in the gym. Terrible. But we do know that the larger the range of motion, the more muscle damage. And I think there's a lot of studies that support that overall, right? The cool thing to understand that I think that Charlie goes about on nuances of that is you can impact how quickly you recover by the exercise selection that you have. And we'll talk about that, I think, later, but the main thing is, like, if I select an exercise on a given body part that has greater range of motion, it's going to take me longer to recover. If I select one that has less range of motion, it might allow me to increase my frequency and recover faster. So you can strategically implement exercises to increase or decrease frequency. So I think those are the main things. Was there anything you wanted to add on to those?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you'll have different opinions on this because there's a couple people that are starting to come to similar conclusions, but for our purposes, this is what we think, are the primary impactors or determinants. And again, the muscle fiber makeup and the size of the muscle are specific to the muscle itself, right? The range of motion that you use is the training variable that you get to pick. So that's the one thing too. I think, the first two are inherent. There's nothing you can really do about it unless you train for endurance or purely power for a long time, I guess. Mm-hmm. But the third one, there is something you can do about that. So that's going to give us clues that we can talk about both today and probably next week as well.
Yeah, and so I think what we're going to do, guys, is instead of saying you have the traditional bro split where people were cued and asked, I train one time a week. You have your traditional person who's going to come and say, you should train everything twice a week, right? What Charlie or I are going to tell you, and that's why I think the surprising part of this is, it could be you might train a body part anywhere from 2 to 6 to 7 days a week. And that's going to be dictated by the body part. So really answer your question on this podcast, I think we got to delve into each of these body parts. So let's do this. Let's take some examples of body parts. And I think we can go ahead and start with calves. Charlie's everyone's favorite. Charlie's got these massive, enormous, kind of dinosaur calves.
Never trained them once. Got them from my dad.
So besides genetics on calves, we know that if you don't have it, you're going to have to train them at a certain frequency. You'll have to train them hard, So, let's break these down, right? If we were to break these things down, remember, are they fast twitch? Are they slow twitch? That's going to determine recovery. And calves are
slow twitch.
They're slow twitch. And why? Because you're walking around all day. They're postural muscles. They're developed to stand and walk long distances. So calves are slow twitch, right? So that gives us one thing. Well, what about range of motion?
Not a lot.
Not a lot of range of motion.
The ankle itself is pretty restricted. Yep. Most people have terrible ankle range of motion, just inherently to themselves, and then you just have a few degrees of dorsiflexion, and then depending on where your knee's at as far as the gastroc stretch, that's about it. Yep. There's not a whole lot you can do about that.
There's not. Now they can be activated to a high degree, but again, slow twitch, so they're recovering fast, and not a large range of motion. Those are two of the primary mechanisms that we're talking about calves recovery are in favor of recovering quick. So most people go into the gym and all they do is they pick one workout a week. They're at the end of or they do legs. On leg day, they're done. They're destroyed. They did squats, they did leg presses, they did lunges, and now they go to the standing calf raise machine and do 3 sets, half-ass. And so if they train their legs once every 5 days, that's their stimulus for the calves. I can't get my calves to grow. Well, judging based on this, how many times do you think you could train your calves per week?
Probably damn near every day.
Probably damn near every day. So if that's the case, Charlie, you do a lot of programming, obviously. If you could train them every day, I mean, how do you incorporate that into someone's training split?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously a lot of people know your calves technically have 2 different muscles. Well, 3 different muscles if you want to look at the gastrocnemius too. But you have the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscle. The unique thing about the gastrocnemius is that it also crosses the knee joint. So it exhibits a trait called active insufficiency. So essentially, if you flex or bend your knee, that kind of shuts the gastroc off when it comes to motions at the ankle. The soleus has to now take over. So a lot of people know this by now. If you do calf raises with a straight knee, or mostly straight knee, it's targeting the gastroc, right? You have more of a stretch on the gastroc. But if you do seated calf raises or something like that with a bent knee, you're now targeting the soleus. So one way you can kind of work around, if you're getting used to training your calves every day or at least more often, you can alternate standing and seated calf raises every single day to get more frequency, but you're still not necessarily impairing the recovery of one or the other if you're still getting some soreness initially. But the few times I've done calves, I haven't gotten sore at all.
No, it takes a lot to get them sore, calves. Like we pointed out in the past, like you almost have to emphasize the stretch, maybe do intraset stretching. But I think for the most part, and I know you're an advocate of this, is like you could almost superset exercises with calves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except, one thing I've heard you say is, and I think this is intuitive in a sense, you probably don't want to superset squats with calves,
or deadlifts.
Or deadlifts, right?
I've actually torn my calf deadlifting before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
so
crazy.
Maybe deadlifts are a calf workout.
Yeah, they could be.
To a degree.
They could be.
Yeah. And I think too, we can talk about this entire podcast, honestly, but your calves are probably lacking because you leave them at the end of your workout.
Yeah.
When you're tired, you're centrally fatigued, they're just not going to get anything at that point. So if your calves are really, really, really skinny, do them first.
Exactly.
Especially on an upper body day, do your sets of calves and go to the rest of the upper body.
Exactly. I'm with you. So that's calves. So now let's talk about, we'll move up the chain here and let's talk about, we have quads and hamstrings, but we'll contrast them, but let's talk about quads. Your quads are kind of a mix. They're in the middle, about probably 50% fast, 50% slow. And like Charlie talked about, the voluntary activation is lower. It's only like 84%, whereas other muscles are much higher. Right. So I think that's those are the two things: low voluntary activation, moderate fast to slow. So that recovery part is in the middle. But what about range of motion?
I mean, again, like we talked about, most people in the gym, not a lot.
Yeah, not a lot.
If you come train at SPI, it's going to be a lot.
It's going to be a lot.
Because we'll talk about this in another podcast, but the more range of motion you put your quads through, the better they grow.
Exactly.
So that's the biggest tip right there. Do your deep squats, do your deep lunges, split squats, all of it, But yes, if you use these deeper ranges of motion, you're going to get more sore.
Yeah.
The quads can undergo quite a bit of range of motion because you have hip flexion and knee flexion occurring at the same time in virtually every quad exercise, except for leg extensions to an extent. So the deeper you go, the more you're going to hurt the next day.
It's true, but like you said, because of their activation, they seem to recover faster than other leg. And we'll talk about this, but for example, when you're sore for 3 days, typically, me personally, my quads might be a little sore the next day, but they're fine the next day after that, and studies seem to show that. But my adductors are really sore, hamstrings are sore. So you're doing legs, especially full range of motion, you get all these other muscles sore, quads are sore for a day. So based on that, what would you say? You probably could train the quads how many times a week?
You could train quads probably 4, maybe 5 days a week.
4 or 5 days a week.
But the nuance there Yeah, we'll leave that to next week, I think.
Yeah.
We got to leave some secrets for
Yeah.
you guys for next week's
Yeah.
podcast. But like that, I don't. My quads would get sore maybe the first year I trained.
Yeah.
Then since my quads never. I did 6 sets of squats yesterday. My quads feel fine.
Yeah.
My adductors and my butt are on fire.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Quads are fine.
It's the same thing with me.
Yeah.
And he did them. If you guys watched our podcast last week, he did them offset.
Yep.
He's been doing them offset. Did offset the other day too.
Yep. We're torturing ourselves to better you guys eventually.
Exactly. and by the way, it's pretty awesome. So now the hamstrings, if you look at this, the hamstrings, again, similar 50-50. And this is what I think is pretty interesting, guys. The hamstrings are about maybe 50-50. And talk about this, like most people, you hear that they're fast twitch, right?
Yeah.
So why do people say that the hamstrings are always fast twitch?
Well, I think a lot of this comes from some of the studies looking at hamstrings, muscle fiber type composition are done in elite sprinters. Well, duh, they're fast twitch.
Yeah.
They run a 10-second 100 meter, everything is fast twitch, you know? So since we are the 99.99% of the population, our hamstrings probably are not that fast. We're probably all about 50-50. If you run a 10-second 100 meter, you know, this information might not apply to you.
Yeah, exactly,
But most people, research in the general population and even, you know, strength training population, you're going to be 50-50, pretty close to fast slow.
You know, but it kind of brings up a good point. You know, when I was growing up, I played hockey coming up. And one thing, you always had the guy on the team. And you always said, this is the fastest guy on the team. And you always say, man, if this guy could just stay healthy, like, you know, he would be the greatest star in the world. But maybe part of it is the fact that what's making them so good is also what's leading them to maybe being susceptible to injury. Like maybe having ridiculously fast twitch muscle fibers leaves them susceptible to making it harder for them to recover.
I think some studies have actually started to show correlations between predominant fiber type composition, injury, and then recovery from injury as well.
Yeah.
Fast twitch is not good for that.
Yeah, exactly. So for you guys and girls who are predominantly fast, and you know if you are because you're faster than everyone else, you jump higher than everyone else. If that's the case, then you're going to have to pay more attention to recovery in general. You're going to be doing a lot more things on recovery. We could spend a whole podcast just on how to recover, but the point is you're going to have to pay attention more than probably the rest of us. So, so now we know they're 50-50, which seems similar to the quads, but there's something unique about the hamstrings because like we talked about earlier, your hamstrings are probably sore than your quads, right?
Yeah.
Mine too. This goes to something else, and why do you think that is?
Well, the unique thing is we said at the beginning that muscle size, almost always, but not always, dictates how well you can activate a muscle. The hamstrings are really the main muscle that breaks that rule, essentially. The hamstrings are a pretty large muscle, and again, these measurements are taken in general population people. Obviously, you know, depending on your sport activity, whatever, it can change. But in most people, the hamstrings are a pretty big muscle. But the studies have shown you can activate them up to 98% of their voluntary activation or involuntary activation. So even though it's a similar fiber type composition as the quads, that difference in voluntary activation is probably why your hamstrings get more sore after training. And it's also why we probably see when quads and hamstrings are put through the same training protocol in the research, the hamstrings take way longer to recover.
Yeah, exactly.
Same fiber type composition, more or less, but they activate that much better.
And generally speaking, when you're talking about longer versus shorter range of motion, you might recover faster from like a lying leg curl than like a stiff-legged deadlift because you're getting longer range of motion. So those are things you want to factor into your training, recovery if you were trying to increase your hamstrings. So based on that, we talked about the quads being maybe 4 to 5 days a week, but maybe the hamstrings, they recover slower. It might be 2 to 3 days a week.
Yeah. And again, we'll have some tricks on how to increase that frequency, but we'll have to save that for next week.
Exactly. And while you guys are waiting, you guys who are studious, while you're waiting for next week, I want you guys to think about something. How do you overcome this? If you typically are training quads, hams together, doing squats, which can, you know, or deadlifts or whatever, things that can train them at the same time, how do you overcome this discrepancy between quads 4 to 5 days a week and hamstrings 2 to 3. Tune in for next week on that to find out, but try and do your homework yourself and see if you can figure that out in your training. So if we go, and again, leg curls you might recover faster from. So if you're going to do 2 days a week, maybe you're training your overall legs 2 days a week, and then maybe for a recovery day, you're doing something with less range of motion, like hamstring curls or something, you know. So let's talk about glutes. Glutes. There's not a lot of studies on the activation threshold, but I think it's pretty apparent. And you pointed this out in the article that you wrote. A really great article you wrote was basically, think about it. What's one of the most underactivated muscles in the body? It has to be the glutes.
Glutes. Everybody has back pain, tight hamstrings. Glutes are shut off.
Yep. Back pain, tight hamstrings, glutes are shut off. They don't have proper glute development. And then they start training their glutes and they grow really fast because you haven't been activating them. Everyone just thinks, I'll just do squats. I'm going to build my glutes. And they don't. They have big quads and they don't have glutes.
Right.
So we could say from, and of course they're large. So the activation
muscle in the body.
So we could assume based on the activation threshold's lower.
Yeah.
And what about muscle fiber makeup?
It's, and again, we're looking at studies in general population, and then we had one study in like hip arthritis patients. So that's, not really going to consider that too much. So they're about 50-50, maybe a little on the slow side. Again, if you're a sprinter, jumper, something like that, they'll probably be a little bit faster. But again, general population, most people, close to 50-50, maybe a little on the slow side.
So low activation threshold, probably 50-50, so they can recover kind of moderately, right? So then what's gonna, so they seem in that case, and then range of motion, you could, when you're doing glute specific exercises, like hip thrusts, bands, that are like, we know these are glute activators, the range of motion isn't super high and it's primarily shortening type of movement, right?
Yeah, peak tension is where the muscles are shortest.
Yep.
So, and again, that's a clue for what we're going to talk about next week. But on the flip side of that, you have deep squats, split squats, lunges, especially split squats and lunges, just because how the pelvis has to rotate to counteract each leg. And that's a huge range of motion on the glutes.
So you would say split squats and lunges are going to create more damage than squats?
I think so. I mean, in my personal experience, absolutely. And then just from looking at it biomechanically and kinematically, yeah, I think it would.
So that's important to understand. So I guess based on that, Charlie, if someone is training their legs in general lower body twice a week and they're doing the squats and they're doing lunges and during that time, because the glutes can recover, you might be able to train them 4 days a week.
Yeah.
But how would you divide that up as far as maybe you did 2 days a week with like squats, lunges? What would you fill in the other 2 days with?
Well, you're just gonna have to wait till next week to find out.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Good.
Can't give away too many clues.
Can't give away too much. So those would be our hacks. Next week we're going to talk about how we can maximize training frequency and even push body parts out to train them 6 days a week. But again, it's going to depend on how they recover. We do recommend you could train the glutes 4 days a week, maybe even 5 depending.
Yeah.
People have had a lot of success with that. Next week we'll get into the mechanics of how.
Yeah.
So let's switch over to upper body. I think, guys, intuitively we know this, but if we talk about the core, right? The abs. When you talk about the abs, and even like the spinal erectors, talk about their purpose and how that dictates the fiber makeup.
A lot of people think that like the core is for doing crunches and stuff. Like, sure, it's active in that. The main purpose of the core, the main structure and design of the core from biomechanics or anatomy standpoint is just to stabilize the spine and pelvis. So when we look at it that way, we have to stabilize our spine and pelvis. Like we're doing it right now, we're sitting down. There's not a lot of muscles we're working except for our core. You remain upright. So with that in mind, the core is mostly slow twitch. A lot of these postural muscles, very slow twitch because they have to be at least somewhat on almost all the time, unless you're just actually fully asleep.
And the activation threshold is not super high in the abs either. I think it's fairly close to the quads, about 86%, right? So low activation threshold, primarily slow twitch. And what about range of motion?
again, it kind of depends on how you train them. But realistically, if you look at that, depending on the trunk movements you're doing, whether it's crunches, side bends, rotation, it's just not a lot of range of motion as it is. And even to that extent, a lot of the ab muscles, like especially the rectus abdominis, that six-pack muscle, it's not really designed for length change necessarily.
Yeah.
It's more so acts like a spring. Like a lot of, I think Stuart McGill talks about this. Big time, spine health. He works with a lot of strength athletes. He talks about how the core needs to be more or less a spring that's just transferring force from the lower body to the upper body and vice versa. It's not necessarily do your really deep decline sit-ups and stuff like that. I mean, that's just a lot of hip flexion for the most part.
Yeah.
But when you look at the core muscles themselves, there's not a lot of length change going on within the muscle itself. So realistically, I think all the cues are pointing towards the abs can be trained pretty often.
Well, it's interesting. When I was bodybuilding and in my best condition, I would do hanging leg raises for my rectus femoris. So I was trying to get the split in the quads, and a lot of people do it for abs, but I actually would do hanging leg raises for that, and it popped like the rectus femoris. Like you could see the split in my quads so much better when I did that. And a lot of people think, that's like abs, but man, it's a lot of hip flexors, right? And when you're sore, a lot of times you're sore in your hip flexors, you think it's your lower abs, and it's not.
Right.
So based on that, is there something old school bodybuilders would kind of train their abs almost every day? Is that, would you say that could be a recommendation?
Yeah, I don't think that's a problem at all. I mean, obviously, think about it like say, and this is a tip we'll go ahead and give away. It's something we should talk about next week. But say, you're doing upper body one day, you have a lower body workout the next day where you want to do heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, stuff like that. Maybe you skip core the day before. That way your abs, your spinal erectors, everything is truly ready to stabilize and support during those heavy lower body movements. But besides that, like you have nothing special going on the next day, hit your abs.
Right.
If you have nothing to save them for, keep hitting them.
And I know Fernando, our graphic, the guy who's doing all the graphic shirts, he likes to train abs every single day.
Non-stop.
So basically, now, let's go on the opposite spectrum here of muscles that take a long time to recover. And I don't know about you, but like I have been training a long time, and I train my chest today. I could do a few sets of chest and they're sore the next day.
Yeah.
Right? Have you guys noticed that? It's not hard to get your chest sore. Like it's hard to get your abs sore, it's hard to get your calves sore, it's hard to get your quads sore, but your chest, even if you've been training them for 15, 20 years, you go under, you do a few sets of bench press, and they're sore the next day. So why do you guys think that is? Think about that for a second. Let's analyze each of those. But if we break this down, I'm going to ask you guys this. Why do you think that is? Are they primarily fast or slow? What do you think? You're right, it's fast, right? I hope you pick that up.
Yeah. I'll never know, but I hope so.
Yeah, I know. Range of motion, like think about it, you can do pretty large range of motion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When you're doing flies. So boom, those are two things that kind of get you. What about activation?
The activation, from my digging, at least maybe 6 months ago, I couldn't find anything. But if we went off of the general rule that we're going by muscle size, the pecs are smaller than the triceps, bigger than the biceps. So it makes us think there's somewhere in the high 90s, between 95 and 98% probably.
Yeah.
So very well activated. I mean, it's really the three horsemen of the soreness apocalypse.
Yeah.
The chest, and it's shown in research too, the really cool study we kind of hinted at a few times, the pecs are the slowest recovering muscle group in the body.
Yeah.
And they're also most likely the fastest twitch muscle group in the body as well.
Yeah. So based on this, out of all the bodybuilders we're talking about, the only one that falls on the 2 days a week rule would probably be the pecs.
Yeah.
Think about that. Everyone's training everything twice a week, and only of all your body parts, the only one that really fits that criteria is probably the pecs. Mm-hmm. So I think when you're thinking about that, I think having training the pecs twice a week, maybe Monday, Fridays, or whatever, could work well for you guys. Even if you're trying to optimize the size of it, but that's the only one that seems to generally fall in that. And we all think this, it's kind of crazy. Like got to hit my chest twice, got to hit my back twice, got to hit my calves twice or whatever. But guys, look, only one muscle. And that's why we're saying when we started this off, go, hey, it will surprise you what we say. And it shows you how individual muscles are, right? Mm-hmm. So let's go into bicep. Let's talk about the arms, biceps and triceps. Again, both of them are probably, would you say, as far as fast twitch?
They're both pretty fast.
Pretty fast,
the
right?
pecs are the fastest, but the biceps and triceps are right after them. They're pretty close.
Yep. But what's intriguing is like now the triceps are bigger than the biceps.
Yeah, quite a bit
bigger. But it's interesting because most people want big arms, but they probably spend 3 times more training biceps. You know what I mean? But the triceps are like about 3 times the size of the biceps. And they activate pretty high.
Yeah, activate very high.
Both about close 90, greater than 95%. Mm-hmm. So if they're both fast twitch and they both have high activation threshold, you would go, oh, you train them the same with similar frequency, but what's the one thing that seems to separate them?
The range of motion is the big separator. If you look at what the biceps do, all the biceps do is shorten. You shouldn't be hyperextending your elbow to try to get biceps gains, right? So, and this is really probably outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but the biceps are one of a few muscles that even biomechanically only shortens. It'll never go past its resting length from a lengthwise standpoint. So your range of motion related soreness at the biceps is not much. We see it in some studies because they're using people who have never picked up a weight before. But I mean, if you've been training for a while, your biceps probably are not going to get sore. I never get mine sore.
It's very difficult.
I could
very
do
hard.
200 reps on the preacher curl in the corner and be fine the next day.
And Fernando does that every day. And he's
every
not
day. Every day.
So if we're talking about range of motion, there's what exercise create the greatest range of motion in triceps?
Triceps, you're looking at overhead extensions probably, because that way you're placing the long head on stretch with the arm being overhead, and then you're getting a lot of elbow flexion from whatever it is you're extending, whether it's a dumbbell or a rope. And then you also think about even just like a standing push down, your hands are by your shoulders and then you perform the push down. That's probably more elbow range of motion you're going to undergo than any kind of curl. Because when I do curls, I pretty much stop right about above 90. There's no advantage up here in curls,
right.
So the overall range of motion is definitely greater for the triceps.
And because of that, that's what studies seem to show you, it takes them longer to recover. So if you think about it, probably in general, because the range of motion is somewhat limited with the biceps, you might be able to train them 4 to 5 days a week.
Yeah. And there's a secret to doing that we'll get to next week.
We'll get to next week, yep.
But you can train biceps. I've done it. I've trained biceps every day before, and I had pretty good results.
Right.
I don't look like it, but I used to have pretty good results.
And then triceps probably limited them. What would you say, 2 to 3 days a week?
Yeah, probably 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Again, there's a trick to that we'll go over next week.
Yep. So again, guys, if you step back, you're thinking, man, have you been fully taking advantage of the frequency you could train each body part, right? So again, biceps, triceps, probably 4 to 5 days a week on biceps. You could potentially train them every day. You'll learn how to do that next week. And triceps 2 to 3 days a week, minimum 2, probably 3. So last thing we want to talk about here is traps. If you think about bodybuilding, there's something like a huge shoulders and mountainous, thick traps, right? So, but again, these are more of a postural muscle, right? So when we think about that for a second, if they're a postural muscle, what's their fiber makeup?
Very slow.
Very slow.
One of the slowest in the body, actually.
Yeah.
And again, because they're just used for, we think posture is just spine and pelvis. It's also your shoulder blades, your scapula.
Yeah.
I mean, it's maintaining the position of those through every movement of your arms is super important. That's what the traps do.
Yeah. So they have good range of motion, and they're activated to a high amount, but they're primarily slow. And remember, we said probably that's one of the number one dictators of recovery because of the tension. So based on that, would you say they are a quick recovery muscle?
Oh, yeah. I think the first time I did drugs, my traps got sore, and then after that,
never. I know.
Never got them sore.
I know. So based on that, you probably can train them 4 to 6 days a week,
Yeah.
And so now when you think about it, say you're training back, you could train them with back. If you're training shoulders, you can train them with shoulders. It's pretty easy to get them on, if on both back days kind of and shoulder days, I think in general too. What muscle groups do we have left?
I think lats are the only one. And lats are one of those muscles too where we just don't have a ton of research on, which we get into these situations a lot. I think lats are just one of those. They're not the hamstrings, they're not the calves, they're not used in walking or physical therapy situations as much, so we don't have a lot of research. But the lats, muscle fiber type wise, probably somewhere around 50-50. They're involved in shoulder functions, which would make you think they're a little bit faster because the pecs and triceps are involved in those. They're upper body in general, but the lats are also involved in spine stabilization to an extent. So they might be a little bit on the slower side compared to pecs and triceps. When it comes to voluntary activation, again, we don't know. We don't have information on that. Now, we can use the general rule concerning muscle size or muscle volume. The lats are kind of one of those tricky muscles because we look at, a picture of Ronnie Coleman, for instance, doing a lat spread. Lats look huge, right? He's a barn door. But the lats, comparatively, from a volume standpoint, are actually smaller than the triceps even. They're a really thin sheet of muscle that just gets spread really wide. I think they're closer in size to somewhere around where the pecs are at. So if we use that theory, they're probably mid to high 90s voluntary activation. Lastly, range of motion. What do you think about that with lats?
Well, lats can have a high range of motion, right? Especially if you look at how much movement you can have at the shoulder.
Yeah.
So range of motion can be pretty high. So would you say that based on what you're saying, that the recovery might be somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle probably. And I think the study we're looking at, it is somewhere in the middle. It's faster than the pecs and triceps for sure, but not quite as fast as the quads or even hamstrings to that extent. Now, the one interesting thing from my time in powerlifting is that guys like Dave Tate or Louis Simmons are always right. You have to train your lats every single day.
Now, that's interesting because if you think about it, I know from a bodybuilding perspective, they say that you win a contest from the back. You mentioned Ronnie Coleman. Think about it, Ronnie Coleman, Dorian Yates, Lee Haney. All these people had massive, Phil Heath. All these people had enormous backs. So I can see why, from that perspective, you might want to train the lats every day. But Dave Tate's probably not trying to compete in a bodybuilding contest.
He did do bodybuilding for a little while, but for his purpose of writing that, I don't think it's.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. He did good. He did. That's right. He did.
Jacked dude.
You're right.
Jacked.
Good point. But his purpose is, so he's writing for powerlifting. Why would a powerlifter want to train their lats so much?
I think to their degree, especially Dave Tate and Louis Simmons, you have to think about they're writing or creating content for geared powerlifting, which if you guys don't know is geared powerlifting is the squat suits, the bench shirts, the deadlift suits, and then raw powerlifting is none of that stuff. It's just knee wraps or even sleeves in some federations and belts and stuff. So in geared powerlifting, the lats are pretty much used in every movement. In the bench press, I think it's a bit of a misnomer on their part. I think they're mostly thinking of the serratus, which we have an entire article about on our website if you want to check it out. But in a geared bench press, the lats probably do play a pretty big role in controlling the bar path when you're lowering the bar. Because with the bench shirt on, you have to get that bar path perfect or else you're going to drop 800-900 pounds in your face.
Right, and then you'll die.
In a squat, the lats do play a stabilization role with the spine. And we talk about, in the Muscle PhD Academy even, we go over the correct way to squat and the correct way to activate your lats in order to help stabilize your spine during the squat. When you figure out how to do that, it helps your squat a ton, but especially in powerlifting and in geared powerlifting where you're squatting 1,000 pounds, you need your lats to be active the entire time to help stabilize. And then for me, the most important one I think the lats are used in is the deadlift. Now, you're gonna have some people that disagree with this. They don't know what they're talking about. The lats are the muscle group that keeps the deadlift or the bar close to the body. If you know anything about mechanics or biomechanics at all, the further the bar is away from your center of mass or your belly button, the harder it is to pick up. You can make 100 pounds feel like 500 pounds if you push it out far enough in front of yourself. But the closer you keep that bar to your body, the easier it is to lift. And your lats are the main dictator of how close that bar is to your body. So from a powerlifting standpoint, you might want to get used to training your lats every day so that they have that work capacity to truly be called upon in all those big power lifts.
You say like minimum frequency, would you say probably 3 to 5 times a week?
For bodybuilders, probably 3 or 4 times a week.
3 to 4 times a week.
Fine. And again, there's different ways you can do that. We'll go over that next week.
Exactly right. So summarizing this up, probably like your calves, you might be able to train every single day because they're slow twitch. Your abs or core, you might be able to train 4 to 6 days a week. Quads, 4 to 5 days a week. Glutes, 3 to 4 days a week. Triceps, 2 to 3 days, probably closer to 3. Biceps, 3 to 4. Lats, 3 to 4. And it's all based on these principles that we talked about. So I think next week, if you want to know about what's the difference, how do I push it out to that higher end frequency, and some other tricks, we're going to give that to you. We're going to give you basically some hacks that maximize training frequency. And so I think that's going to be very exciting. So with that, thanks so much. Anything you want to add, Charlie?
I don't think so. I think the one thing we want to add is I think we'll give out one really good tip right here. If you're wanting to boost frequency for a muscle group and you're wondering if you can train whether you're sore or not, what's your biggest tip on that?
Well, basically, I think if you warm up, and Charlie, this is something I picked up from you, but like if you warm up, the warm-up itself, you shouldn't be sore after your warm-up. If you're still sore after your warm-up, you probably shouldn't train.
Skip it.
Yeah.
A lot of people think blasting through that pain is you have to do that for gains. It's dumb. Your chances of getting hurt are higher. And again, we talk about that soreness is going to lead to a reduction of activation, a reduction in force production. You're not getting anything out of that workout that way. Just wait till you're ready to go. To a point, we'll go over this more next week, but there's no reason to train through soreness for most people.
There you go. So, guys, thank you so much. We'll see you on more tips for training frequency next week.
Thanks, guys.